Without further ado, I'm going to introduce Deb Parnon from the Darien Athletic Foundation.
Good evening, and thank you, Kira. Good evening, and thank you for being here tonight. We're all here to support the effort to raise awareness of how our behavior affects others, to empower our kids, and hopefully adults too, to stand up to what they instinctively know is wrong and put an end to bullying. My name is Debbie Parnon, and I am part of a new organization in town called the Darien Athletic Foundation. The DAF includes Darien High School athletic teams, their coaches, youth programs, and community members who are passionate about Darien athletics. One of the many benefits of being an athlete or playing on a team is the development of self-confidence. The Darien Athletic Foundation supports the notion that athletes are in a position to lead by example. This self-confidence can be channeled in many positive ways that could ultimately create a culture at our schools that doesn't tolerate bullying and accepts people for who they are. Imagine that. On behalf of the Darien Athletic Foundation Board, I would like to thank the YWCA's Parent Awareness Group, the Life Solutions Center, and the Darien Library for bringing Jamie to Darien, and to all of you for supporting this cause. Thank you.
So I'm going to be real quick. I second all of the thank yous. I'm not going to torture you and say them all again, but 3 quick housekeeping things. Tomorrow, Jamie is doing a follow-up coffee at the First Congregational Church of Darien. Anybody who wants to have specific conversations with him, that's the place to do it. There'll be coffee, there'll be bagels, you know, and time. Number 2, housekeeping, March 20th, that's next Wednesday. Parent Awareness is also hosting a pressure, anxiety, and social stress. That's going to be at Middlesex, right, Courtney? Okay, and then in April, everyone mark their calendars because it is the Stand Against Racism Awareness Week for the YW. We have a really exciting guest coming to talk to us on April 25th. Carrie Kennedy will be the keynote speaker at Weburn at 9:30 in the morning. Without any further ado, I thank all of our community members for being here today, especially our officers, Ray Osborne. I think there's an Sergeant Isaacs back there. And that's it. On to the movie.
People that came together to bring me here because this is an important issue, and it's obviously something that's a very personal issue to me. And I want to start by talking about what it was that I did in the school today. I did a very abbreviated version of what I would normally do in an assembly, but at the very beginning of it, I ask a series of questions at every school I go to. And I'm going to share with you what those questions are and the answers. Because as much as I know that most schools don't look like my school, every school has an issue with bullying and harassment. And most of the time it's verbally. It's the things that kids say. And I think the biggest lie that's ever been told to anyone, children mostly, is that sticks and stones will break your bones, but words will never hurt you. I don't think that there's a bigger lie that's ever been told, because words have a way of destroying people from the inside. And one of the things that I think is something that a lot of people don't realize, but we have more kids in this country die every single year from suicide because of bullying than we do from all of the youth violence, all of the violence put together against teenagers. More kids are killing themselves every year, and a majority of those suicides have to do with bullying. And so the questions I asked, though, at the school today were, how many of them have heard somebody say "that's so gay" in the last week? And I probably had about 60–70% of their hands go up. And then I asked how many of them have heard somebody use the word retard. It was probably closer to 80% of their hands went up. I then asked how many of them have heard somebody called a fag or a dyke, and I would say it was probably about 50% of their hands went up. And then I asked how many of them have heard somebody called a bitch, a slut, or a whore, and I would say 90% of the students' hands went up. And then I asked how many of them have seen those words on the internet used against their classmates, and I would say about 70% of the kids' hands went up. And then my final question was, how many of them believe that every student walks into their building every day feeling safe and welcome, and not one hand went up. And that's when I think it hits home to them that that's why I'm there. Like, this is a serious issue, and as much as the violence that was happening to me wasn't happening in their school, there's an issue. And there are people coming into that school every day who don't feel safe and wish they didn't have to be there, and there are people leaving there in pain every night because of the things that are said or done to them or about them. And so That's why I continued to do this work. I started asking those questions in the beginning of what I did so that I had an idea of what schools were like. And I continue to do it so that the students get an idea, but the students typically know the answers. But as I look around and I see teachers and administrators going, really? That many students are raising their hands for these questions, and and they all know that there are students coming here that don't feel safe and welcome. That's a problem. And so what I want to do tonight is talk to you about kind of an overview of what I think is going wrong and what I think we need to be doing in this country. And the very first thing I want to talk about is prevention, because it's one of those things, if you actually do it, you don't have a problem to begin with. And then I want to talk about a comprehensive approach, which doesn't look like a crime and punishment model, which is I think what a lot of schools are going to right now, which I think is a mistake. And then I want to talk about the community response, because we all know that there's not classes in kindergarten on how to bully and how to be mean. You know, there's obviously kids are learning this from somewhere else and bringing it with them into schools, and we need to talk about that. And so the first thing I want to talk about is prevention. And like I said, it's one of those things, if we did, we wouldn't have as much of a problem as we do anyway. But I firmly believe that the United States believes that they are better crisis managers than they are prevention managers, and we'd rather spend 10 times more on a crisis than we would if we just spent a little bit of money to prevent something. But that's what we do. But I want to talk about what I know works as far as preventing bullying. The very first thing that I think is critically important is we need to start talking about and teaching kids about the world that they're going to live in. Not the world that we lived in 1952, and not the world that some people wish we lived in, but the world that we actually live in. Talking about the diversity that's in that world, all of the diversity that's in that world. Race, religion, sexual orientation, all of it. And the reason that we do this, and somebody said, well, why do we have to do that just to make a minority of people feel comfortable? And it's not about that. It's about making sure we all are comfortable and we all can live together. And I want to share with you a story of what happened to me when I was at Wells Fargo that really represented and showed why this is so important. I had two young women that started at the same time. I was a manager in the personal banker training program. So I was managing people as they were coming through to train to be personal bankers. And I had two young women that both had graduated from college, were both 22, and were both very eager and excited to work at Wells Fargo at the big bank in the big city of Minneapolis, okay? One of these young women had grown up in Somalia. She ended up coming here as a refugee at 10 years old, did a crash course in English, and ended up graduating at the top of her high school of 2,000 students. Full ride scholarship to Carleton Business School in Minneapolis at the University of Minnesota. Graduated from there with honors and was coming to Wells Fargo really excited because she was going to be able to work in a bank that would serve her community. And she understood her community probably better than any of us at the bank, able to speak their language, understand their culture, understand the religious differences as far as banking goes. And we were excited to have her. We had another young woman who had went to a school in a small town in Minnesota that was almost exclusively white and almost exclusively Christian. She then went to a Christian college in a small town in Minnesota, also graduated with honors, and came to Wells Fargo and was really excited to be at the bank. And we were really excited to have her. She was very smart, she was very eager, we thought she would do really well. So I'm in my 4th day of training with them, and my job at the end of the day was to come in and to bring the real world into what they learned. Because a lot of our trainers were never in banks, so they knew a lot about stuff, but they didn't know how it related to what they would do in the branches. So my job was to come in and make that real. And I'm sitting there, we're talking about money laundering and terrorism, and this is 2005. And so I'm talking about these things and how it relates, and then I had the young woman who grew up in the town that was mostly white and Christian raise her hand and ask, why is it that we can't wire money to countries who sponsor terrorism, but we can hire the people that come from those countries at our bank? Referring directly to this woman who was sitting right, in class next to her. And we had to have a small conversation outside of the classroom. And unfortunately, we had to have 3 more, and then we terminated her. She was not prepared to live in the world and to respect people who were different than her. No one taught her these things. No one in her church, no one in her community, no one in her home, and no one in her school. And we're failing all of our children when we fail to do that. This is about making sure that all of our kids can grow up and live together, work together, and get along. And so that's number 1. We need to do a better job of that. The second thing that we need to do, which is critically important, is teach kids the skill of empathy. And yes, empathy is a skill. I've had to explain this to people before. I had somebody say to me that I think empathy is either something you're born with or you're not. And I would say, well, you sometimes look at how Congress relates to each other. You'd think that's true. But in reality, empathy is a skill and it can be taught. And there was an incredible study out of Canada that looked at this issue. And what they found was they brought an infant into a kindergarten classroom, okay, for 1 hour a week for 5 years, with the sole purpose of asking the kindergartners, then the first graders, then the second graders, what was the baby, then the toddler, and then the young child thinking and feeling. So the whole purpose was to prove that they could increase the empathy that these kids would be able to identify. And then at the end of this time, they ended up watching videos of scenarios and asking the children to identify what those people were thinking and feeling. And there was almost a 70% increase in their ability to recognize people's feelings and what people were thinking in the videos compared to the control group who hadn't went through the experiment with the baby, okay? And so they did a follow-up study when these kids were in 10th grade. And what they found was that there was not just a significant decrease in the amount of bullying and harassment of the kids who went through the empathy study, but the severity of the bullying and harassment and the length of time it went on was severely reduced. And when you think about that, it makes sense. When you have to think about how your words and actions affect those you're doing them to, it's much harder to do them. In my situation, no one ever called me names and looked me in the eye. No one ever looked at me when they were hitting me. Because it's really hard to look at somebody's humanity and hurt them. And that's what teaching empathy is all about. And we need to be doing a better job of it, not just with little kids, but throughout K-12 education. And I would say some adults need some help as well, to be honest. The last thing I want to talk about is a lot of people are surprised to hear me say this, but one of the things that every study has identified in the United States is that lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender kids are the #1 group of kids getting harassed in schools, okay? And I don't think that's a surprise to a lot of people. But I'm going to tell you right now, I don't think we have a problem with homophobia in our schools. We have a problem with sexism. We do not have kids getting harassed in 2nd grade because they're coming to church with their gay pride shirts on, right? But we have kids in 2nd grade being harassed because they don't act like a boy is supposed to act, or they don't act like a girl is supposed to act. And this is not just an LGBT issue. No kid in this country lives up to the ideal of what it means to be a boy or what it means to be a girl. And that means we have all of our kids failing, and we're doing a very good job, every one of us, of keeping those kids in line. From a very early age, children are told that's not what boys do. Girls don't play with those toys. Boys don't cross their legs like that. And it's an issue. Because what that sends is a message to our kids that it is okay to treat people who don't act like they're supposed to act horribly. And that harassment continues. And then what it means to be a woman today is very different than what it meant 50 years ago. But on the flip side of that, what it means to be a guy today is not very different what it meant to be a guy 50 years ago. And even that in and of itself is sexist when you think about it. And it's perfectly okay. I mean, I say that girls have come a long way, girls and women, and that is unless they're doing something better than guys, then there's a problem. Or if they're taking opportunities away from guys, then there's a problem. One of the things that kind of struck me as very humorous, but it was very poignant, was I was sitting with a group of Gay Straight Alliance students, and I had a young woman in the group who was very butch. And she came out in her 9th grade year, and she really didn't have a lot of problems. She said a lot of the guys treated her like one of the guys. She played sports, and they thought that she was really cool. Everything changed in her 11th grade year when she started dating one of the really hot cheerleaders. She was taking something away from the boys they thought was theirs, and they weren't going to have it. And that's when her harassment started. So we've got to take a look at that, because I can guarantee you if that was a guy coming out in his 9th grade year and was very effeminate, he wouldn't have had the same response in his school. He would have had a very different response. And that's part of the reason why I had the experience that I had, and that's a lot of the reasons why a lot of young men have this experience. And so do young women. If they get too far out of line, like I said, from what it means to be a woman, they have a problem. And we need to start looking at this. And I say the first place that we need to look is in the mirror. Because I think each and every one of us says things that are very sexist. We're holding our kids to standards of what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman. And all of us have within us, we are all sexist. We are all racist. We are all homophobic. We can't not be and live in the society we live in, dealing with the media that we deal with. All of that stuff plays into this. And one of the things I say is we have to look in the mirror. And we have to say, what about what I say? What about what I'm doing? Do I need to think about and reevaluate? And also, what about what I'm thinking? And I had a teacher at a training once ask me, how do I know if I'm thinking something I shouldn't be? That's a hard one. Like, I'd like to think I know, but I don't think I always do. And I said, would you feel comfortable saying it out loud in front of your colleagues? If the answer is no, then you might want to reevaluate that. Because I know that I do the same thing. Within a certain context, within certain friends, there are things I'd say I would never say in front of all of you. We all do it. And we need to do a better job of self-policing ourselves so that we're looking at those things and saying, wait a minute. Because that's the example that we're sending to our kids. So I want to shift now to a comprehensive approach to bullying. One of the things that I'm seeing over and over again, and you see it a lot in the news, is that bullying has become a crime and punishment issue in this country. And so what I mean by that is in most schools, there's a list of things that happen when you bully, and it's treated like a crime, right? There's certain punishments for certain behaviors, and it escalates as it gets worse. And I want to share with you a story about why I think that that's a problem. So while I've been doing this work for a while, and I was at a high school in Minneapolis, and I had about 1,200 kids in the auditorium. And I finished up my presentation and I opened it up to the Q&A, and I had a kid in the 4th row raise his hand, and I will be honest, I continually looked and hoped anyone else in the entire auditorium would raise their hand. Why? Because this kid looked like the kids who harassed me in school, and I thought, well, I don't know what he's going to say, but it made me uncomfortable. But eventually, no one wants to go first in assemblies, right? So I called on this young man, and I said, what's your question? And he said, can I come up and give you a hug? Which made me more uncomfortable. Not because I don't like hugs, but because I thought, why does he want to give me a hug, right? So I said sure, and he came up and gave me kind of an awkward hug, and everybody laughed, and he sat back down, and I went on, and I didn't think too much more about it. I'm leaving the school that day, and the guidance counselor says to me, that was really odd. He's one of the biggest bullies in the school. He's constantly calling kids fag and retard and beating kids up. And she said, I'm going to get to the bottom of it, because I'm pretty sure he made a big joke of this whole thing. And I said, okay. I didn't think too much more about it, and I went back to work, and I'm sitting at my desk about 2 weeks later, and my phone rings, and it's the guidance counselor again. And she said, do you remember the kid that hugged you? And I said, yeah. And she said, his mom is on the phone on hold, and she won't hang up until I give her your number. Is it okay? And I said, now I'm really nervous, because moms have a way of making me scared. But I said, you know what? I'd be happy to talk to her, give her my telephone number. And this woman calls me, and she's extremely emotional. She can hardly speak. And she said, I want to tell you about my son. My son went into kindergarten so excited and eager to learn. Every teacher he had throughout grade school talked about what a smart kid he was, what a leader he was, and what a nice child he was. And every day he'd come home and say, Mom, I want to tell you about my day. I want to tell you about what I learned. She said, then he entered 6th grade, and everything changed. The first thing I noticed is he quit coming home to tell me about his day. He'd just go right to his room, he'd slam the door. And she said, I thought, okay, he's growing up, he doesn't want to talk to his mom anymore, that's okay. But then she said his grades started dropping. He started getting in trouble in school, and he started harassing kids more and more. And it ended up not just verbal, but physical harassment. She said twice he's been sent to juvenile detention because of assaulting other kids. And she said, me and my husband have sent him to counseling. We went to family counseling. We've tried to do everything we know how to do, and nothing changed. She said, he came home from school the day that you did your assembly and said, Mom, I want to tell you about my day for the first time since 5th grade. And he told her about the assembly, and then he started to cry. And he told his mom how horrible he felt for all the kids he'd hurt, the things he'd done, and then he told his mom that he was gay. And some people are surprised. I mean, I tell this story at schools, and all the kids go, like, gasp, like, really? Well, the thing is, he entered 6th grade knowing the worst thing he could possibly do was tell other people who he really was, because he knew he would be the brunt of all of the harassment. And so instead of that, he decided to become the one that was doing the harassing. And the other part of it that I think is very relevant is that when you really think about it, it doesn't make any sense for somebody to obsess about who someone else loves or dates unless they're jealous or unless they like you, right? There's no reason for somebody else to obsess about those things. But that gets to the heart of why I think that we're failing when we're just doing punishment as a way of dealing with this issue. Because yes, we need to keep the kids who are being harassed safe. We need to make sure that they haven't internalized the messages that they've received. But just as important, we need to help the kids who are doing the harassment. Because kids don't wake up one day and decide they're going to be mean. They don't. Something has happened in that child's life. They're watching their mom get the crap beat out of her at home. They have an older sibling who's abusing them. They've been harassed all through grade school, and they're tired of it, and they become the harasser. And I would say 90% of the time, no one is taking the time to sit that child down and say, what is going on? We need to be doing that more. Because if we don't, we're failing half the kids. And the other problem that we have, and I don't think a lot of people look at this, but bullying is not just an issue that we have in school. We just call it something different when kids grow up. And there's no magical reset button, I tell kids all the time, that makes everything that happened in school go away. If you've been damaged and abused because of harassment, you continue that into adulthood. And a lot of people end up with drug and alcohol abuse problems. They end up in domestically violent relationships because that's all they know. But the same goes true with the kids who are doing the harassment. Those kids don't magically just become great citizens and treat people nicely. They end up being bullies. We just call them other things, like domestic violence, like child abuse. There was a study that was done at the University of California that examined men who were in prison for random acts of violence. And they found that 90% of those men were bullies when they were in school. They had a history of bullying. They didn't stop being bullied. They just found new people to do it to. So this is a societal problem if we don't deal with it when kids are young. I want to say a couple other things about the comprehensive approach. One of the things that has been working in a lot of schools, and this is something that I highly suggest for schools to use, is more of a situation where we're getting kids to talk about what's going on together. And a lot of times that's called, I'm drawing a complete blank. I love it when this happens. Restorative justice. A restorative justice model. And how many of you are familiar with restorative justice and what that looks like and means? Okay. I want to just give you an example of a school that used this and had no clue that they were using it, but it was a very effective way of dealing with a situation. So there was a situation in a northern Wisconsin school. It was a very small school, and they had 11 boys in a gym class. And one of the boys had went downstairs, changed clothes, came back upstairs, and they all went back down to change. And he went back down there to find all of his clothes in the urinal in the locker room. So he went up and told the gym teacher, who went and got the guidance counselor, and the guidance counselor brought all 11 of these boys into her office. She sat them in a circle, and she says, we're going to sit here until we figure out what happened, and it didn't take long, since it was the end of the day and everybody wanted to go home, for them to figure out who did this. But then what she did was she made the kids go around in a circle and talk about what it would feel like if those were your clothes and that happened to you. By the 8th kid, she said the kid who had done this was bawling his eyes out. And like I said earlier, most people would feel horrible if they knew the pain that they caused by the actions that they took. But so often we're punishing kids, sending them to detention, suspending them or expelling them from school, and never having these conversations. And I can tell you what justice is to me is that somebody learns a lesson and somebody feels like they feel better about the situation when they left and they know they're safe. That's what justice is. It is not revenge. It is not punishment for the sake of punishment. And one of the things that people are surprised to hear me say, but Roy Grandy, who was the young man who came to the trial, he was one of my biggest harassers in school. I think Roy was also a victim. And a lot of people are surprised to hear me say that, but I'll tell you why. Roy was a victim because he was told by his church, by his family, by his community, and by his school that being gay was wrong and treating me the way he did was okay. And when Roy got into the real world at 19 and him and 2 of his friends assaulted somebody leaving a gay bar in northern Wisconsin, Roy spent 3.5 years in prison. That's where he was when he came to my trial. And Roy's been back 3 more times to prison. And the saddest part for me of all of that is I got a message on Facebook last year from Roy's stepson telling me that Roy is the same guy he was when he was in school. Now he just bullies his mom and him. Another reason why we need to help all of the kids who are involved in these situations. A couple other things I just want to say about comprehensive approach. Zero tolerance does not work. It never has. And the quicker we realize that, the better off we're going to be. Just last year in Wisconsin, I don't know why this happened in Wisconsin as well, but it did. One kid gave another kid a fish oil caplet. Did anybody hear about this on the news? And he got expelled from 10 days from school. If he'd brought little packs of heroin and handed them out to every single kid in the school, he would have had the exact same punishment. Common sense needs to be used more often when we're dealing with these situations and not just a blanket policy. And I'll tell you why that doesn't work for bullying and harassment. Because it seems easy, well, yeah, we should have zero tolerance for bullying and harassment. But when you apply it to a zero tolerance program where every single action has the same response, this is why that doesn't work. You've got 2 kids walking down a hallway and they're buddies, and you know that. And one of them is joking with the other one and calls him a fag. You absolutely need to stop that and explain to them why that's not appropriate. But how you treat that situation needs to be very different than how you treat the same situation where a kid's walking down the hallway and calls another kid a fag to harass or demean that kid. Both of them can be teachable moments where the kid walks away understanding why he shouldn't use that word. Or it could be a situation where he understands that that's a word he can't use when you're around. Because that's what zero tolerance does. We absolutely need to move away from that. One of the other things I think is critical, and this is something that I don't hear a lot when we're talking about bullying conversations, is classroom management skills are hugely important. And I think everyone sitting here can remember back to high school, and we remember the teachers who seemed to have eyeballs on every side of their head and knew everything that was happening in their classroom. We all remember those teachers. And we also remember the teachers who seemed clueless and unaware of anything that happened in their classroom. And that's still true today. We still have teachers like that. And the problem is those teachers who are completely unaware are the worst classrooms in schools for kids to be who are being harassed and abused. And at the very least, our classrooms need to be safe places, because if they're not, kids are not learning, period. And I had a school that had a very interesting approach to this. They actually asked the students. I was doing a follow-up session with a small group of students, and one of the students brought up the fact there was a teacher who was stuff was always happening in her classroom. And so the principal happened to be in the room, and he said, I want a list of the teachers who are really good at this, and I want a list of the teachers who are not so good at this. And what he ended up doing was doing a mentorship program that lasted a year long, where the teachers who weren't so good had to observe the ones who were. They had to then write a report about the changes they were going to make to their own classroom management style. And they had to give that report at the end of the year. And he was going to observe them, and if he didn't see changes, they would be terminated. Because the reality is we need teachers who can manage their classrooms as well as teach. If they can't, they don't belong in the classroom. There are other places for them, period. Because there's absolutely no reason. And the other flip side of that is, in this day and age, my case established that administrators were personally responsible if they didn't do their job. In the last 5 years, teachers, guidance counselors, school social workers, and other people that work in schools have been found personally liable for not doing their job. And I'll tell you what the #1 excuse was from those people. I was told by the student they didn't want anybody to know. If you have a child coming to you and saying they're being abused at home, would a teacher keep that quiet? Absolutely not. It should be no different if they're saying I'm being abused in school. Mandatory reporting is called mandatory for a reason. It's not optional reporting, right? And we absolutely need to be doing a better job of that. So I want to end by talking about this as a community problem, because it absolutely is, and that's why I'm so glad that all of you are here, because this is an issue that we really need to talk about. This is not just a school issue, and schools alone cannot solve this problem. We need to be talking about this. This is a religious issue. This is a community issue. This is a family issue. And we need everybody's help to start working on this problem and solve this problem. And one of the things that I think is important in this conversation is the fact that there are most groups of people I think we've recognized and identified and would say that those groups of people should not be harassed, right? The severely disabled, I think if they're getting harassed, most people would say that is not okay. And there's a lot of other groups. But for whatever reason, kids saying, that's so gay, kids calling each other fag and dyke is still allowed in many of our schools. It's allowed by teachers. They ignore it. And I know they ignore it because I've seen it, I've heard from students, and it's a problem. And I want to talk about one of the things that I think is really important in all of this is that we're expecting our kids to treat each other with respect and treat each other as equals, but as adults we don't do the same thing. We do a horrible job in this country being role models for our kids in general. Governments don't even talk anymore. If you're on the opposite side of the aisle, you shout at each other through somebody else. You don't even talk directly to each other. In communities, we don't have conversations like we need to. People just write letters, angry letters to newspapers or yell at meetings instead of having dialogue and conversations. And the thing that I think is really important, considering that the #1 group of kids that are identified in every national study that's been done that are being harassed are LGBT kids, is this. How are we expecting our kids to treat each other with respect and as equals when we as adults don't do the same thing? Period. And one of the things that I think is going to be critically important when we look back at history is the fall of 2010 is going to go down in history in a lot of ways. And I'll tell you why. If you remember back to the, well, some of us probably can't remember this, but if you remember in history, in the late 50s and early 60s, I believe that a majority of Americans really didn't care that much about African American civil rights. Period. They didn't. They cared about their kids getting a good education. They cared about having good jobs. They cared about being able to put food on the table. And all that changed when they turned their TVs on in the late 50s and early 60s and saw people nonviolently protesting for those very things. The right to a good education, the right to a fair job. And they saw them being hosed down, attacked with dogs, and killed because they were standing up nonviolently for the right to have those very things. And a lot of Americans started saying, wait a minute, this isn't okay. I may not have cared before, but I have to now. Because this is an American, and I need to stand up. And there's not been one civil rights movement in this country that's ever succeeded because a minority of people stood up and everybody else just said, sure, we'll give them their rights. That doesn't happen. It only happens when the majority of people start to care about the fact that these people need their rights. And I'll tell you, the fall of 2010 will be remembered in history in the same way for LGBT people, as well as for the bullying movement. Because I think that for most people in America, they really didn't care about gay marriage that much. They were more worried about their own marriage, their own kids. They didn't worry about gays in the military or gay rights in general. But when they started turning on their TVs that fall and seeing child after child after child take their own lives because of how they were being treated, they said, this isn't okay. We need to do something. And the last election, I think, proved that. For the first time in this country, a majority of people in 4 states voted on the side of gay rights. And I can tell you that kids in that state got a message from those votes that said, you know what, I have a place here. I'm important. And I really want every one of you to think about that, because this is it's an important issue, obviously, a personal one to me, but we've got hundreds of thousands of kids sitting around in our schools in this country listening to dialogue that I never had to listen to as a child, and most of you did not either. I grew up Catholic, and I went to my Catholic church, and I never heard one thing about homosexuality my entire childhood. I didn't have to hear about it in my home. I didn't have to hear about it on TV. I didn't have to hear about it in political debates. And now, young LGBT people are sitting around this country and they're hearing horrible things about them from our politicians, from their priests and pastors, from their parents. And it's no wonder a lot of those kids start saying, I shouldn't exist either because nobody wants me to. And it's no wonder that our kids in school think it's okay to treat kids who are different because we're doing the same thing as adults. And one of the things I want everybody to think about is this. We look at history books today and we look at black and white photos of of angry white people protesting against interracial marriage, about integrating schools, and we say those are bigots. And we know what the history has written, and we know what side of history we're on now. But in 50 years from now, we're going to be looking at some kind of holographic textbook that we can't envision yet, right? And kids are going to look at photos, again, of mostly angry white people protesting against gay marriage, protesting against gay rights, and we too will call them bigots. But what really matters when this comes down to it is what side of history are you on now when it matters. Not in 20 years from now, like my grandfather used to say, oh, I always thought the blacks were okay. Right? But it matters now. And it matters for our kids. Because we are losing far too many children in this country because they don't think they have a place here. And we need to do a lot better job of making sure that they feel they do have a place here. And so with that, I want to open it up to your questions. I'm going to grab my water while you think about your questions. Yeah?
I have a question. How do you get boys to talk and to tell you what's going on? If something's happening to my son, and some days he tells me, some days he doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
Some days he reports to the administration, some days he doesn't.
Are you just coming right out and asking him?
No.
Okay.
No.
Because I would say that's not usually the best strategy. Not with young boys.
Hi, how's your day?
Yeah. Find something that he likes to talk about, whatever that is, whether it's a video game or a cartoon, or I don't know how old he is, but find something that he likes to talk about and get him talking. And I think that will really go a long way, because he'll start saying things that he normally wouldn't probably say if you just came right out and asked him. That would be my advice.
I was wondering why, as a member of a community, you didn't go to the police for help.
Yeah, and so I'll repeat the questions just so that everybody can hear them. The question was, why didn't I go to the police, or why didn't my parents go to the police? And we did. We went to the police on numerous occasions because we knew what was happening was also illegal as well as wrong. And the police's response over and over again was, this is a school disciplinary matter because it's happening on school grounds. Which I know doesn't make a lot of sense. That's like if I murder somebody at my house and the police come and I say, you know what? Don't worry about this. I'm going to punish myself. And so it happened at my house, so we're good. It makes no sense whatsoever. And I can tell you that after the settlement, there was a liaison assigned to the school within 3 weeks. And so they realized that they had also failed. And when I sat down with my lawyer initially, she asked, who are we going to sue here? Who do you feel is the most responsible? And she goes, we can sue their parents. We can sue the police. We can sue the school. But when I really had to think about it, it was those three principles. They had a professional but also a moral obligation to do the right thing, follow the law, and protect me, and they chose not to. And so as much as the police should have done something, I really felt like they were the ones that knew exactly what was happening to me every single day and still chose to do nothing. So that's what really happened, and I know that the Ashland Police Department is much more involved in what's happening in the school now and are dealing with things that are criminal in the school. So, yeah.
You were talking a little bit about empathy and the idea of having people understand and how would you feel. A concern that I have is that there are a lot of bystanders. A lot of people stood there and watched what happened to you. A lot of people, they don't want to get involved because then someone's going to pick on me. And I especially find that, you know, as our kids get into middle school and even into high school, you have to feel that the social pressure of getting involved and how do we get our kids to stand up and to say something. It may not be happening to them, but it's happening to somebody else.
Yeah. And the work that I do in school is specifically about that. It's pretty much my entire thing that I do in school. I don't know, I think there are some students here who were at the high school presentation today. Did I see a couple? Anyone? No? Okay, well, there was, but that's exactly what I do when I'm in schools. Because part of the problem right now is that I don't think we're having enough conversations about what responsibilities is. That this is a responsibility that you have to do the right thing. And one of the things I say, which a lot of kids sit there and look at me and their mouths open when I say this, is that if you're popular and you sit there and watch as your friends harass and demean other people, you are just as responsible for that harassment when you stay silent as if you were doing it yourself. And I think a lot of people are really uncomfortable when I say that. And I tell a story about one of the apologies that I received was from a young woman who went to my school who was very popular. She was a cheerleader. She was dating a football player who harassed me horrendously. Her friends said things to me, but she never once said a word to me. And she sent me a message on Facebook and apologized to me. And I got a lot of messages like that from students who never did anything to me who apologized. But the response I got back when I thanked her for this, I wasn't expecting. She now has a 12-year-old son who's in school getting harassed every day because kids think he's gay. And she says, as a parent, I feel powerless. But she said, as a student, I had so much power. I could have told my boyfriend to leave you alone. I could have told my friends to knock it off. I could have stood up and said treating you like that was wrong. And I chose to stay silent because I didn't want anybody thinking anything different of me. And I share that story with every school I go to because it's so powerful and it's so important. And and kids look at that and say, yeah. You know, I mean, throughout history, there's been examples of times when people that did know better, that should have spoken up, didn't. And sometimes, yeah, it's dangerous, right? Sometimes it's a scary thing. And I tell students, if you can't do that because you don't have that kind of power, and if you stood up, you're putting yourself in a dangerous position. I'm not going to ask you to stand up, but I'm going to ask you to let somebody know what's going on, period. Because one of the things I think about is think about all those schools where we've lost kids. And what would have happened if one of those students had went to a teacher, a guidance counselor, a principal, and said, you know what, so-and-so's getting bullied really bad and I don't think they're doing well? They might still be here today. You know, and so it really is about having those conversations about responsibility. And the Speak Truth to Power program, which is going to be in the schools here, does exactly that. You know, about 18 months ago now, I was chosen as one of the defenders of human rights through the Speak Truth to Power program. And as much as I was honored by that, by being chosen, what I saw in that was they're choosing to say that schools, being in school and being safe is a human right. And I think most people would agree that that's true, but we don't think about it in those terms. And I also think about the fact that if there was a news report out today about kids in schools in China or Iran or Russia being treated the way our kids are being treated, our State Department would be all over that. Our president would be speaking out against how kids were being treated in other countries. And yet it's happening right here, and we're not talking enough about it. We don't have a national commission, you know, by the president because we've got kids killing themselves every year because of bullying. We need one. You know, there needs to be more. But as far as that, we really need to teach kids about that responsibility, and that's a great way of doing it. That's what I do when I go into the schools. I mean, one person described my school assemblies as a giant guilt trip, and if that's what it is, so be it. It really does get kids to think about what they're saying and what they're doing, as well as what their friends are doing, and that's the point of that. Yeah.
What should be done? So, I mean, if I was a bystander and I saw someone bullying, obviously I could do something But what about in today's age where kids can be, bullies can be texting their victims or contact them via social media, and there is no, in your face you can see them bullying. It's more on the, on the backside. How should that be addressed?
Depends on how it's being done, but most bullying that happens on Facebook or Twitter is done for the public response. There is some, obviously, that's private messages and that sort of thing. But I would say that in those situations, we have to encourage kids to speak up and tell somebody what's going on. I mean, and that's the problem. Almost 90% they estimate of all the harassment and bullying that happens in schools never is reported. And how do you get kids to tell you that something's going on? As parents, you need to start asking and having conversations. And it can start as a general conversation about what's bullying like in your school. Tell me what you see. And sometimes that starts a conversation where a kid says, well, actually, it happens to me sometimes. That sort of thing. But I would say that most of the time, people are on Facebook or on Twitter because they're wanting a public response. They want to humiliate somebody publicly. And one of the things that I say is, and I talk about this in the thing, when the reason I started asking about the words bitch, slut, and whore are because one of the biggest issues I see is they estimate that it's somewhere between 80 and 90% of internet harassment is girls against girls. And anybody that works in schools will know that this is the way it is. And part of the reason for that, when I was in school, it was before the internet, which sounds like I'm horribly old at this point. But there was no internet when I was in school. But what it meant for a girl to do something was to write a note, a vicious note calling another girl a name, and pass it around a class until the teacher grabbed it, right? And maybe 3 of the girls in that class would have seen that and giggled. But now what that means is I'm going to put it on somebody's wall. And the perception of the person seeing that, even if it's removed immediately, is that the entire world has now seen what that is. And it is so devastating to young women to think that the entire world just read some horrible thing about them. That's the real big problem. And what we need to do is get students to start standing up on social media and reporting it to Facebook. I want to share an example with you that I talk about in schools to give students an example of what they can do on this issue. Is I went to a school in Pennsylvania where they had had a suicide 2 months before I was there. That's the reason that they brought me in. And the young woman that had killed herself was horribly harassed on Facebook. That was the main medium that they used to harass her. And I ended up going there, and about 40 students wanted to meet with me afterwards who had formed an anti-bullying club. And they wanted to meet with me to talk about their plan to deal with Facebook bullying. And I went into this meeting very excited and open-minded, and then they told me what their plan was, and I didn't believe that they could actually do this. So I'll tell you what they said to me. They said, we want to start monitoring. Each of us are going to take about 20 kids, and we'll monitor the walls of those kids and what they put on other people's walls. And I said, okay, so you're going to monitor, and then you're going to write it down and tell the principal, right? And he said, no. We're going to report it to Facebook. We're going to tell them to knock it off, and then we're going to say something positive about the person that they're harassing. I said, wow, that's a lot. And oh, we're not done yet. I said, okay, what else do you want to do? And they said one of the things that we all ignored is this young woman writing horrible things about herself on Facebook, which kids do all the time. Talking about how stupid they are, how ugly they are, how fat they are, all of these different things. And they said, when we see kids doing that, we want to say something positive about them. And I said, wow. And I left there encouraging them, but thinking in the back of my head, they're never going to actually do this. This is a lot of work. It's going to take so much effort. They're going to have to do this every single day. And so about 2 weeks after I left this school, I get a phone call from the principal. And he said, I need to tell you what's happened at my school. And I said, okay. He said, after 2 days, 38 kids lost their Facebook accounts in my school. Because if you get reported 3 times for harassment, you get suspended for 30 days. And I can tell you, there's not much worse that you can do to a teenager than take their Facebook away for 30 days, okay? So he said 38 kids had their Facebook accounts suspended, but he said the amazing thing that happened after day 2 was it wasn't just the 40 kids who started this club doing this. All the other kids started doing it. They started telling kids to knock it off. They started saying positive things about other kids. And he said within 4 days, there was no more harassment at all. Nobody dared say anything because the whole school would jump on them and tell them to knock it off, right? And then he said what really was amazing to him, and he didn't expect this, was it started to overflow into the school. Once these kids realized that a majority of them wanted their schools to be safe and wanted people to treat each other with respect, they started saying things in the classrooms, in the hallways, everywhere. He said within 2 weeks it was like a completely different place. And to me, that's the thing that I think that schools need to do more of, is putting this in the hands of the students. Because no bullying program in this country, I believe, has ever worked unless it's student-led and student-initiated. That doesn't mean that we can't put an idea in their head, but we have to at least make them think it's theirs. And then let them run with it. And I've seen school after school transformed in that way because students decided they've had enough. But you got to get them to care. And part of the reason why I think I go into schools is my film gets them to care. They see this as an issue, but a lot of times they don't see it as an issue that their school has, right? Because what was happening to me was so horrible. But then I ask the questions about what they're hearing on a regular basis, and they go, wait a minute, it is a problem. And once I get them to see that it's a problem, and I give them some ideas of how they can actually solve it, that's what makes things change. Because they start to care, then they act. Because, you know, we all want the world to be a better place. We all hope it gets better. But wanting and hoping never got anyone anywhere. You actually have to do something. And that's what I do, really what I want to encourage students to do when I'm in schools. So, other questions? Yeah?
Thanks for sharing and taking us down first of all. What was so troubling to see not only what you experienced, but by the bullies themselves, but being bullied by the system.
Yeah.
And it seems like the system is set up incorrectly in the sense that it doesn't have a lot of the things that you feel that need to be brought to bear on the issue, like restorative justice and stuff. It seemed to be a legally oriented process. And almost labeling the bullying and the people not becoming then paralyzed by addressing it because of the legality and the overbearing components of it. And how did you stay so strong and not lose faith kind of in just humanity of the people and just grown-ups? I mean, people that you think that you could have relied on to be there for you that weren't. And what can we do about the way in which the system is oriented currently?
Okay. That's a lot. I will start with what kept me strong. I mean, the biggest thing I have to say was my family, the support that I received from my family. I think no matter what, every child needs to feel like somebody cares and that somebody will do something for them. Somebody will help them. And even if that's not the kid's parents, because sometimes we know that that can't be the case, children still need to feel that they have an advocate, somebody who will stand by them and with them and help them, right? And I think that that goes to that second part of what we can do. And I think that in every school, kids need to feel like they have somebody. And one of the things that schools are really successful when they have great relationships between teachers and other people, and they have small groups that meet, and there has to be someone that kids connect with. And for every kid, it's different. Sometimes it will be the guidance counselor. Sometimes it'll be a specific teacher. Sometimes it's somebody completely different. I mean, it just depends on the student. But the other things that I say, because kids always ask me, like, how'd you get through all this? And, you know, I think for me, I also have I think a pretty decent sense of humor. And that helped me a lot, because a lot of times I'd come home and I'd have the worst possible day. And my family in general, they make jokes a lot, and they do that sort of thing. And my family would get me to laugh. And regardless of how bad my day was, once I did that, I felt better. And I felt safe, and things could go on. And then the other thing for me was music. Music was an escape, but it was also something that I used to connect with my emotions. Because sometimes I'm very much up here, and I'm thinking about things, and I'm not feeling them. And music helps me to get to a place where I can feel something. So, and I think we really need to have more connections in school, connections between people in school, and not necessarily even adults and kids, but even between kids. Because sometimes one of the things that I think is the worst thing when you're going through something like this is I felt totally alone when I was at school. Even though I had sometimes adults that cared about me, I didn't feel like they understood, right? Because caring and understanding are two different things. And I felt totally alone. And I know for so many kids, I get messages on Facebook all the time. I leave Facebook open so that kids can contact me. And I get a lot of messages about how lonely they feel and how completely alienated they feel in their own schools. And that's something that I think we need to work more on. Yeah?
How effective do you feel getting the bullies and the victims together in the same room is?
So how effective do I think getting the bully, the child who's bullying and the child who's the victim in the same room? I think it's hugely effective. And I think the only way that that shouldn't happen is if something is extremely sexual or extremely violent. There's certain things that cannot be done through talking out in that situations because it's inappropriate. But I think almost all other situations, which is 99% of what's happening, I think that is the thing you need to do. Because if you have those two kids sit down and talk about what happened and get the kid to talk about this is what you did and this is how it made me feel, and have the other kid then repeat that, which is that's part of that restorative justice thing, and then have them, I think you end up with a sincere apology, because I think everybody at some time in their life has been made to apologize and they didn't really mean it, right? I mean, how many times we say, no, apologize to your brother, and You say it, but nobody really means it. But in that model where somebody actually has to listen to what the other person was feeling and then repeat it back, I think more than likely they're going to really feel bad. You know, because unless, and somebody asked me, well, what if somebody has an antisocial personality disorder? Well, that's a different issue, and that's not something you can resolve in that way. But not a lot of kids actually have that. Most bullying is not because of that. It's something else.
But does it take a lot of courage for the victim to actually confront their bullies?
To a certain degree, but it also empowers them in a huge way. If you get to sit there with somebody in a comfortable situation, with somebody that you trust that's leading this conversation, and tell somebody, this is what you did and this is how it made me feel. I mean, to me, I got to do that in court, right? I mean, that was my time to confront my biggest bullies, which were my 3 principals. And there's probably no greater moment in my life where I felt I had power. For once in my life, somebody was going to listen to me, and a judge is sitting there and a jury is sitting there, and they're going to decide what's going to happen here, right? But I think in the restorative justice model, where that there's a lot of empowerment that happens from that moment, and at the end of it, they get a sincere apology, and what everybody wants is for it never to happen again. And I think when you punish somebody, a lot of times there is retaliation, which is a lot of times what kids are afraid of. They don't tell because they think it'll get worse, or because somebody's threatened them, like in my case. If you say anything, it's going to get worse. I'm going to beat you up more, or I'm going to kill you, or whatever the case may be. But in those situations, a lot of times kids leave there feeling different about the whole situation.
And how long did the harassment of your family continue after when you decided to sue them?
How long did the harassment of my family continue? It basically continued until the case was won. And I think part of the reason for that was the town really didn't know all about what happened to me. There was very little information that was out there until the trial. Okay? And once all that information came out, the newspaper wrote a huge article about how the school needed to change and that this was the right outcome. I mean, they were very much on our side, and before that, they didn't take a side, right? But also, like, people wrote letters to the newspaper. People called my family and apologized, called my family to thank them for what they did. And the town changed, and I don't think it's any different than what I'm asking about in schools. I think a majority of people in Ashland, once they found out what happened, they knew this was wrong, and the people that didn't agree with that kept their mouths shut because they knew they weren't in the majority anymore. And they knew it wasn't okay or popular to say anything against my family or against me. So, and I started going back to Ashland without fear of what would happen to me. Before that, I wouldn't go anywhere in town without my family, without somebody with me, because I was afraid of what would happen to me. And you know, now I go to Ashland and I'm very comfortable. I mean, I go back there for the 4th of July. I go back there for a lot of different things. I'll walk downtown Ashland by myself to go shopping, to do whatever, and I'm not afraid. And I know people know me, people, you know, will come up and talk to me. So it's a very different place, but I think most places are like that. When you've got a system where things look really bad, there's a majority of people in any school, there's a majority of people in any company, there's a majority of people in any country that are good people. But a lot of times they get a bad rap because of a minority of people who are being very vocal or who are being very bad and doing bad things. But in general, it all stopped right then. And it was pretty bad. I mean, a lot of the stuff didn't even make it. My parents had their house shot at. They had dead animals left in their mailbox. They had the threats on the voicemail, all of that stuff. So... yeah.
What about buses? Like, I'm sorry, what about behavior on buses? I think there's no adult supervision because the driver has to pay attention to what they're doing.
Yep.
And I've heard of so many parents who drive their kids to school because their kids say, I'm not taking the bus anymore.
Yeah. I think it's absolutely ridiculous for anyone to expect a bus driver to drive and also take care of 50 kids behind them. Most parents can't handle the 2 that are behind them while they're driving. I mean, think about that for a second, right? And yet we're expecting bus drivers to drive and to drive safely and to follow all the traffic laws, to remember where to drop every kid off, and to keep every child safe. It's ridiculous. And schools that I know that have taken on this issue, some schools pay bus monitors. But I know school districts that don't have money to do that. And one school district I went to, they had an anti-bullying group that formed, but it was more of a bullying support group, to be honest. The kids that I met with in this group were really damaged kids. They all been bullied, and they went there more for support than they were able to advocate for themselves. But one of the huge things that came out of this is they had identified the worst place in their whole day was on the school bus. It was a rural school in Pennsylvania. And they identified the bus was the worst place they could be, and this was in a middle school. And so one of the kids said, well, can't we have people on the buses that will watch things and make sure that nobody gets bullied? And the teacher said, well, yeah, why don't we go to the principal? And they asked, and they said, we can't afford it. We have no money. And so then she came back and she said, well, my grandma said she'll ride my bus in the morning and at night. And the teacher was like, okay. And then one of the other kids said, well, I think my mom would do it. And so then the school decided that they would put out, like in their community letter or whatever, asking for volunteers. They had so many people sign up to volunteer that they didn't have enough buses for the people. But the critical thing with that is that you have to have the right people on those buses. I think everybody remembers what happened in Rochester, New York with the bus monitor on the bus who was severely bullied. And I watched that, and yes, I feel sorry for the woman, but I also felt sorry for the probably 5, 10 kids who were on that bus that were also being bullied every day because she wasn't stopping it. You need to have proper training, and you need to have the right people. Not everybody can be a bus monitor, right? And there are people that would be really good at that job, but they also need proper training on how to handle it, what the school policies are, and that sort of thing. So that's what I would say about buses. So more right here.
I'd like to hear your thoughts about adult bullying. Can you talk a little bit about what happens? And I'm not talking about violence, between strangers, specifically workplace bullying.
Yep.
And there aren't many states that have legislation about workplace bullying. Do you take a position on that? And do you think you can kind of rehabilitate adults when they've got to that stage of their bullying?
Well, there's a lot there too, but I'll start with the first part. I believe that bullying is a word that we use mostly for students, but I think bullying is a lifespan issue. We've got adults that are in nursing homes being bullied by the staff and being bullied by their relatives who are taking advantage of them. We've got people everywhere between that are being bullied and harassed. All bullying is somebody taking the power that they have and using it over another person in whatever way they're using that power. And I think that workplace harassment, in a lot of ways though, is much, it's way less than what happens in schools. And I'll tell you why. If anyone had said anything or done anything to me at Wells Fargo that happened to me while I was at Ashland, they would have been fired and criminal charges would have been pressed immediately. We spend a lot of money in this company, and you can ask anybody that works in a corporation. They spend a huge amount of money talking about harassment, talking about sexual harassment, talking about the consequences, and it's just not tolerated. Does that mean it doesn't happen? No, it does happen. But typically, why does a bully choose somebody? Because they're going to be affected and because they're going to be silent. That's why bullies choose their victims. And the worst thing that the bully wants, or the worst thing that can happen, is somebody to stand up and say no and tell somebody what's going on. So, I mean, and it is all related. It's all about power. It's all about abuse of power. And yes, I do think that people can change and people can, but and I think that's not a situation where you sit people down and say, how did it make you feel when you kept coming on to Susan at work? No, that is not the appropriate place for something like that, right? But in a workplace, it wouldn't be tolerated. And I asked kids that question. I said, what do you think would have happened to me if any of these things had happened to me when I was at Wells Fargo? And they all immediately know they would have been fired. And I said, isn't it ironic that we tell kids all the time that this is character building, this is what makes kids stronger? I hear this from adults all the time. When I'll be on a radio talk show and I'll have somebody call in and say, I was bullied, it made me a better person, and blah, blah, blah. And I said, that's great, but we have kids that are not strong enough. And there are far better ways to build kids' character than to treat them like crap every day for their school years, right? We have better ways that we can do that. So, yeah.
Do you think we should start the conversation? I mean, we're talking about high school and middle school, and I have a 4th grader in elementary school here who we're new to this town, and he was severely harassed. Things whispered in his ear that I couldn't even believe. And then I went to the administration, and it was sort of, really? Like no one, and I know my son, and I know what kind of, he's just not going to do that. And so, they had an assembly, or they had whatever it was at the beginning of the school year about bullying. And then it just hasn't been brought up again. So I wonder, in elementary school, I can't help but think this 4th grader, who he's going to become when he becomes middle school, high school, and beyond. And so what can we do at the elementary school level, maturity-wise? I mean,
And I don't specifically work in middle or in grade schools, but I'll tell you some things. I mean, there's a lot of great programs out there, but it is about having those conversations younger. A conversation like any kind of conversation really should be had in smaller groups, because the younger you go, as I very well know, the more honest kids are, and you need to be careful with that, because kids in grade school will say anything in front of all their classmates in the whole school that they wouldn't necessarily say by the time they got to junior high or high school, right? And so, but there's ways of doing that, and there's a lot of great programs out there that do teach empathy, that do teach respect for other people. But the problem is I think sometimes these are given to kids in a way that becomes almost a joke. You know, I was in Wyoming last November, and one of the things that every single kid in the whole state seemed to tell me about was the anti-bullying clown that came in when they were in grade school, and what a huge joke this was. This guy was a former rodeo clown that would come in and be all kinds of goofy and talk about how you have to be nice to each other, and it became like a big joke. Like, this was not something that kids said were very helpful in any way, shape, or form. But there's a lot of great things that are out there, and there's a lot of great programs, and a lot of them, I think the most effective ones, are completely free. And they're about having classroom conversations. There's about materials with questions that teachers can ask. And that really, I think, is some of the best stuff that can be done. So, but it absolutely needs to start much younger. It's just not going to happen with me. I had one event where they asked me, would you go into a 5th grade? And I had like 300 5th graders. And I had 19, and I'm not even kidding, in 1 hour I had 19 incidents of mandatory reporting issues that kids talked about. It's just not something at that grade level that you can have a conversation on a large scale about. Because and I don't know these kids. I have to look at the kid, look at the teacher, look at the kid. Are you looking at the kid? Like, to make sure that somebody's paying attention, because I'm going to leave there. I don't know who these kids are. And the poor principal's just writing like crazy. And I told them I don't think this was a good idea, but they insisted. They're like, oh no, I think it'll be fine. It wasn't fine. So big assemblies, not so good for grade schools. We have time for one more question. You kind of have your hand up?
I think they are doing something in elementary schools, but it's also something to do with stranger danger and understanding that.
Yeah.
It's kids in crisis.
So, I mean, that's a start.
Yeah.
I have a quick question. What is the mandatory reporting policy now in the schools?
Well, there's a mandatory reporting policy. I'm pretty sure it's in every state. For any kind of abuse that's happening, it must be reported. And I think a lot of people, correct, it doesn't matter if a child is saying they're being abused in any way by anyone, there's a mandatory reporting law that says teachers, guidance counselors, principals, there's a lot of different categories, counselors, you know. Yeah, there's, I mean, a huge amount of people that are obligated to say something. I think that a lot of people don't realize that that means bullying. They don't think it means harassment. They think it means some kind of abuse at home, physical abuse or otherwise. Yeah, I don't think that they get that it's bigger than that. So, and one of the other things that's a huge issue, and I'm not going to go into this because it's a huge long conversation, but a lot of times what ends up happening in schools is that people are not understanding the difference between bullying and harassment. And we use bullying and harassment interchangeably, and I do as well. And for the purposes of what we're talking about, that's fine. But when it comes to what schools need to do and what their responsibilities are for the two are very different. And most people, I can ask most principals, I can ask superintendents, I can ask teachers, none of them know the difference. And the difference is a harassment is a federally defined thing, and it's somebody who's in a protected class. And it's harassment because of those protected classes. Bullying is everything else. So bullying but we use it interchangeably. But when it comes to schools and how they report things, they're legally obligated when they hear about harassment to report it in a certain way. And if they don't, and they get called on that, when they get sued, they will lose. When they the federal government comes in to investigate, they will get marked against them. There's a school in Minnesota right now that's on the verge of being shut down, an entire district, and they will be taken over by the federal government because they're not doing the right things on harassment. Right? But the thing that I want to say that's important about that, one more thing, is for anybody who's here, if you're advocating for a student, if you're trying to get somebody to pay attention to you, you need to use words that are criminal, not bullying. Because every day, I think if I was a principal, I probably hear 50 times a day the word bullying. But what I don't hear is assault. What I don't hear is sexual harassment. What I don't hear is sexual assault. But when you've got a kid who's been physically harmed in any way, they've been assaulted. And you need to use that language because you will get attention immediately from whoever you call. If you've got a child who's had anything sexual said to them, that's sexual harassment. And believe me, people's ears will perk up and they'll say, oh, there's a book about that tells me exactly what I have to do. And I'm going to follow that to the letter because I know this is serious. And when somebody's physically touched in a sexual way, that's a sexual assault. And when you use those language in advocating for kids, you will get much further than you would if you called and said, my child was bullied again today. Because that's something they're hearing 50 times in a day, and it just becomes background noise for a lot of people. And it's not that they don't care, it's just that it's just so overwhelming. But you have to use those languages. And then also, a lot of times I say it's important to get the police involved, especially when you've got something like an assault or a sexual harassment happening, because it needs to be seen as a serious issue. by both the parents of this child, by the child, and by the school sometimes as well. Because hopefully the school will take it seriously, but believe me, if the police are involved, it's a little bit more serious, right? So, yes.